If you see a blossom tree, be careful where you put your hand. Written by Christian Wallis. Charles stood and admired the building he owned. He was a dapper man in a black suit and a bowler's hat that was a little too big for his head, but Charles was awfully wealthy, so he thought it was okay to look like a cliché. If anything, he thought, it was his duty to stand out, and if that meant hewing a little too closely to the unfashionable trends of the monopoly man, well, so be it. With a building that big and that full of smart, hardworking, and attractive people, Charles felt a little entitled to extravagance. There was a whole world, a whole microcosm of office culture in that building, and he'd started it 43 years before with a desk and a typewriter. Even after all that time, he still crept out of the office at around 1:30 every afternoon to look and admire the place while he quietly munched a sandwich from a greasy brown bag. Next to him were some trees, and Charles was suddenly surprised to hear one speak up and start talking to him. "Psst," he heard as he looked around with a furrowed brow.
"Hey, me, I'm calling you."
Charles couldn't help but instinctively look upwards to the pink blossom tree that curled its branches upwards.
"No, you blasted goon, I'm not a bloody tree. Down, look down. Here, on the floor."
Charles tilted his head, feeling a little foolish, and found himself looking at a squalid drifter laying down in a peculiar pose, with one arm behind his back and his head against the trunk of a tree.
"My God,"
the cracked lips said with a smile.
"You can see me."
Charles pulled himself together and looked the ragged man in the eye.
"What do you want?"
he asked, and was promptly put off at the sight of the haggard man's head being thrown back as he brayed a black-toothed laugh.
"My God,"
he said in a breathy and teary-eyed sign.
"No one sees me, nor looks me in the eye. No. It's the signals, see, that come down from up above and stop people wanting to look me in the eye. And I can't get out myself, you know. What with the hand problem, and I've been here an awful long time. Even if people don't think that I have been here, because when they look, I think they just see a tree. But I can't say for sure what they can and cannot see, because I can only see what I see, and I see me stuck here and unable to... Excuse me?"
Charles had stood up and was counting out some change from his wallet and into his hand. He was content to let a few copper coins plunk down into his palm, but was interrupted by an iron and desperate grip on his ankle.
No!
cried the homeless man.
"I don't need that. I need help. You don't realize I've been here for blinking years. There's some kind of twisted magic at play. I don't know what it is, but you're the first person to have seen me in years, and will you stop that?"
The man cried furiously as Charles, with a concerned frown, placed the coinage gently on the floor and then shook his leg free from the grip.
"For goodness sake!"
the man shouted as Charles walked backwards and turned to hurry towards the large office block.
"You have to help me! I'm stuck!"
Charles left work later that day, at some time around 7, when the summer sun was still going strong. Such times of the day are a gift to late workers like Charles, who appreciate the small amount of time he spent outside on his walk home, in the natural and healthy evening light. Not that he got far on this particular day. He was caught off guard by the sight of his own money looking back at him from across the street. Feeling a little curious, Charles walked over and found himself looking down at the 1 pound and 8 pence he had placed on the floor earlier that day. Throughout history, some men have seen some truly strange things, but none were as confused as Charles in that moment. For one, he would have kissed a rat trap for the smallest amount of money on earth, and it was exactly this sort go-get-em capitalism that he worshipped and believed in. And for another thing, Charles was shocked to imagine that there were vagrants, actual bloody vagrants, who would turn down free money. He could only imagine that the man had left the money there as some kind of insult to Charles, and oh boy, he certainly felt insulted. He leant down and scooped up the money with a scowl on his face, but not before catching sight of a glimmer within a small hollow at the base of the tree. Charles, trying to see better, stopped himself mid-bow, with his hand still gripping the change, and squinted into the dark recesses of the tree trunk. Where the branches above drifted in the wind, sunlight drifted down and moved with the breeze, catching some shiny object at just the right angle to make it twinkle. After a quick check of the street to make sure it was empty and no one would think he was a barmy, Charles got on his knees for a closer look. He tried to reach in but found that at such a top-down angle, his hand couldn't quite get between the fat cheek-like walls of the tree. He knew he'd have more luck if his hand were reaching up into the hollow, but for that, Charles had one more look around for possibly amused spectators, and feeling overwhelmed with excited curiosity, he lay down prone onto his stomach and reached into the hollow. Have you ever been bitten by a dog? Surprisingly, it's not the teeth that hurt, it's the pressure. It's hard to describe, really, but Charles reached in and fumbled about clumsily with his fingers and thought something along the lines of,
A lot of bark. It's all rough. Things are a bit damp, as expected. Smaller than I thought. It looked quite foreboding from the outside in. Wait! I can feel something smooth. Yes, I'm sure it's a ring! I just put a finger through it, and it fits as well as though it were one of my own. How remarkable. I wonder what its worth is. I'll know as soon as I can. Just... wait a minute. Oh, that doesn't make sense.
And then the pressure came. It clamped down on the bones of his hand until the back of his finger met the back of his hand. Charles cried out in agony, but the pressure kept on building and his middle finger was pushed into a coil so tight he thought he was going to pass out from the pain. And yet the pain just didn't stop. In a continued series of cracks, snaps, and shuddering agony, the tree's trunk continued to enclose Charles' hand with such mind-numbing fury that at least one finger was shunted down into the flesh of his hand where it popped out back end first. Charles' screams were electric and violent and shrill and would be a full 45 minutes before whatever force animated the tree were finished with Charles, and he was left, pale and quivering, with the red-rimmed eyes and a teary face on the ground, unable to think or speak for hours and hours. It was morning, and Charles had spent the night vomiting profusely all over the ground where he lay. He was cold, sweaty, afraid, and for the first time in life, he was scruffy and unkempt, and it revolted him. His trousers were damp from where he had been forced to soil himself. He felt as if he had been hurled backwards 60 years to those primordial years where his mother wiped pale yellow-green shit off his lower back and pampered talcum powdered onto his pink and spotty cheeks. At this junction, I feel compelled to clarify that Charles was 68 at this time, and that he had an awfully strange childhood. But in the scheme of things, that isn't actually what's important for this story. Strangely, Charles had spent his sleepless morning plotting vengeance against a tree and the vagrant who he believed had trapped him. Furthermore, Charles hoped and prayed that when the time came to leave, he'd be able to forget his indignity and frightening reminder of his mortality and live the rest of his life as normal. As such, he was incredibly excited when the bus pulled up at a time that seemed about right to his half-conscious mind. He didn't actually catch the bus, and therefore had no clue when it ought to arrive. And he watched as pencil-skirted women with high-collared blouses and pastel-suited men in pointy shoes stepped down off the steps and turned towards the building he owned.
Excuse me,
Charles stuttered, but no one turned.
Excuse me,
he cried a little more defiantly, but no one paid attention to him. This was pretty confusing to poor Charles, so he immediately became angry and started crying after his employees.
God damn you, you worthless bunch of blasted pencil-pushing morons! Look at me! I'm Charles Coleridge, and I demand that you turn!
Charles was caught off guard when a young woman passed by and muttered,
I asked for no ham, honestly?
To one of her colleagues before giving a flick of the wrist. Somehow, through a quirk of physics, a piece of ham flew through the air and slapped Charles across the face. His eruption was volcanic.
Jesus Christ! When I'm out of here, I'm going to rip your fucking head off! Not one of you will have a single job left, just you watch! Destitution will be the only word your children will know how to read, just you!
And then, the bus doors closed, and Charles watched in open-mouthed defeat as the last of his employees, no more than 80 feet away, crossed the street and entered the office. For a few more hours, Charles screamed until he could scream no more. After that, he wept in frustration, and then in defeat. And finally, he ate the ham. Charles was quite happy with the new jacket. He managed, through a complicated series of maneuvers, to catch a cyclist off guard, and with his free hand, grip him by the collar. There, anchored to the tree, he'd used every ounce of leverage available to wrestle the coat off the man, who seemed incredibly baffled as to why he'd crash into nothing whatsoever. Charles had sworn furiously as the cyclist picked himself up, looked at everything but Charles, and then got back on his bike and rode off. But what mattered was that Charles had wrestled a waterproof overcoat off the man's back, and was tearing at the shoulder of one of the sleeves so that he could wear it effectively with one arm pinned. With a cry of triumph, he slid it over his shoulder and comfortably pulled it up around his neck. Charles had, throughout the years, acquired all manner of clothing using this bizarre method, and he was pleased to see that he had gotten much better since the first time he tripped a passing office clerk in the hope of stealing his shoes. He never did get the shoes, but with time and effort, Charles was an expert at sending anyone on wheels flying through the air towards him, acquiring over the many years a wonderful array of strange objects. Charles had a small radio, some cups to fill with rainwater, a few bits of newspaper that covered his head when the rain became unbearable, and a pile of sticks as ammunition. Food came sparsely, and this was an unpleasant fact of his new life. Charles never starved, for should the wait between meals ever become too long, he would sense a lurid exchange of fluids between himself and the tree. As for the toilet, well, let's just say that Charles missed the attention of his mother and her wet wipes. Charles had no clue as to how people who passed him by couldn't smell him, but he supposed that was just part of the tree and its potent effect. He imagined his hand was quite rotten now, almost definitely dead, and during times of investigation, he could clearly see that roots had grown through the withered flesh. In fact, and this was a little too scary for Charles to admit, he was adamant that it was pulling him in, no more than a few inches a year, but it was something he confirmed with certainty using a pin. 8 years after that fateful day, and Charles was now missing a hand and most of his forearm. whereas at the start it had only been his hand. He missed those bones, and of course, he missed his freedom. Charles dwelt on these thoughts after failing to notice that the cyclist had left something else nearby. It was only after that day had passed, and the summer sun started to drift away, leaving behind long shadows, that he noticed its shimmering wink in the sun. It was a red little oblong thing, shaped a bit like a 4-inch long grain of rice dipped in waxy blood.
It's a knife! A bloody knife! A bloody pissing blasting! It's a Swiss Army knife!
Charles cried out, barely able to think clearly in his excitement. It was only 3 feet away, but that might have been a mile as far as he was concerned, since it was on the side of his trapped arm. Still, it was worth a try, and Charles reached out across his chest in a desperate attempt to stretch his free hand and reach, but it was no use. He tried a leg, then his arm, and then his leg again, and then he heard it, a most terrifying sound.
Dude, is that a Swiss Army knife?
The sound of a skateboard clicking rhythmically against the evenly spaced paving slabs grew louder and louder, and Charles watched in horror as he knew his one last chance to escape was rushing away from him. In one swift movement, Charles reached around and grabbed a stick and hurled it at the teenager with the accuracy of a man whose life has literally depended upon it in the past. He sent the backwards caved teenager rolling across the floor. Now, this wasn't one of those friendly run-of-the-mill falls. Bones were broken, and at least 2 other adolescents appeared out of nowhere to pat the boy's shoulder, helping him up and offering tissues to wipe away the blood. In the stoic tradition of all teen males, everyone present ignored any signs of tears. Meanwhile, Charles was spread eagle across the floor, trying to reach the knife with his foot, and hoping that the kids would just bugger straight off to the hospital. "Is she on her way?" Charles heard.
Yeah, she'll take me to the AE.
What happened?
I don't have a clue. I think there was something on the ground. Must have tripped me up.
Is it that red thing over there? Charles' heart fluttered at the mention, and the flip-flop sound of oversized and underlaced trainers sent him into a hysteric panic.
This is it,
he thought.
I can't rely on my legs. I knew I'd have to do this one day.
Using his free arm, Charles reached across his chest towards the knife, twisting against his old shoulder blade, and straining until his bald little head grew pink and a loud agonizing pop rang throughout his bones. With his shoulder dislocated and on the verge of weeping, Charles rotated freely and snatched up the knife. The teenager stopped dead in his tracks and stared at the spot where only a few seconds ago he'd been looking at a clear red object. He turned momentarily over a few thoughts, reminiscing of films like The Matrix and The Truman Show, and then, like most people who are faced with proof of the unreal, he ignored it and carried on like normal. "Can't see anything here that might have tripped you up. Maybe there's something wrong with your board?" Charles sighed, unfolded the knife, and started immediately planning where to cut. Charles missed his hand, but he certainly felt renewed since being released. His estate had prudently waited before declaring anyone legally dead, and when, on that first day of freedom, Charles had clambered past the great big double doors of his prestigious lawyer's office and collapsed onto the floor while blood flowed freely from his rotten stump, it was to his surprise to see that his lawyer was somewhat expectant. In fact, and this was truly strange to poor Charles, no one seemed that bothered that he returned from an 8-year absence stinking of excrement and dressed like a vagrant. If anything, the whole system was designed to accommodate unbelievable acts of eccentricity on behalf of anyone worth more than 500 million. It soon became clear that disappearing for prolonged periods of time was remarkably common amongst the obscenely wealthy, and as the days passed, Charles' dreams of returning in a flurry of glory and tears were left behind to deflate with the rest of his traumatic memories. One client, his lawyer told him, disappeared to become a wrestler in Mexico for 9 years, and returned only after defeating the man who killed his brother. Charles was thankful he didn't have a brother to be killed, or else he too might have been expected to visit Mexico. Still, after weeks and weeks of rehabilitation, infection, disease, and eventually recovery, Charles started to wonder whether he too had his own kind of payback due. He decided he did, and proceeded to return to the tree with a few provisions, one of which was a 300-pound weightlifter who was handcuffed to Charles' remaining arm while clutching a backpack full of saws, and burned the tree to the ground. Up in the office block that had faced Charles for the last 8 years, he could glimpse the huddled and confused faces of hundreds of employees keen to catch a glimpse of their mad boss who had returned after years of absence only to promptly attack the nearby foliage. What they didn't expect to see, however, was the smoke to clear and the revelation of a pile of skeletal and ancient remains. Charles himself counted 18 bodies, with their fists haphazardly inserted into the base of the tree, all at different locations. Later forensic reports would confirm that the bones had been compacted with such force that they had fused into a single calcified lump. Stranger still were reports that on the day of the burning, a strange smelling smoke crossed the downtown area, which, when inhaled, provoked absent-mindedness and selective blindness in many affected persons. A few forensic experts dared to consider the possibility that Charles's mad and wildly fantastic account of his disappearance was somehow true, but by that point, Charles had already left the city to continue his lifelong quest. To this day, he travels from city to city, dropping packets of food near the roots of city trees. Should the packets somehow disappear from plain sight, as if by some miracle, Charles would then promptly burn the damn thing down.